I had lived in this neighborhood for nearly 15 years, long enough to see more HOA board members come and go than I could count, but there was one who never seemed to leave, Karen, the self-appointed enforcer of everything from lawn height to mailbox paint shade, a woman who carried herself as though she had been crowned the queen of our cul-de-sac. My house was a modest two-story with a wide driveway and a detached garage that had been standing since the property was first built, long before the HOA even existed, and that garage had become my sanctuary over the years. It was where I worked on my old truck on weekends, where I stored my fishing gear, and where I kept the kind of tools that you don't just leave lying around in the open. It was a personal space that I valued deeply, not just because of the stuff inside, but because it was mine, my space, my rules. Karen, however, never seemed to understand the concept of personal boundaries. She had knocked on my door more times than I cared to remember, lecturing me about everything from the color of my flower pots to the so-called unauthorized banner I hung up during football season. Every time she showed up, she had that smug clipboard in hand, as though the flimsy piece of plastic somehow gave her legal authority over my entire life. I had learned over the years to deal with her nonsense with a kind of calm politeness, mostly because escalating things never seemed to help, but I always kept my cool until she crossed the line, and lately she had been testing the limits more than ever. I suspected it was because my son, Mark, had moved back in with me after completing his police academy training. He was a rookie cop now, stationed just a few towns over, and when Karen saw the cruiser parked in my driveway a few nights in a row, it probably triggered that paranoid control freak streak she had. She started leaving more letters in my mailbox, passive-aggressive little notes about unregistered vehicles and nuisance activity after dark, even though Mark's cruiser was an official law enforcement vehicle and was perfectly legal to park anywhere. I could tell she didn't like the idea of a cop living here, probably because it meant her petty HOA fiefdom might actually have to follow real laws for once. Things started escalating about 3 weeks before the big incident. I had just come home from work, exhausted, and found Karen in my driveway peering through the little side window of my garage door like she owned the place. When I pulled in, she jumped back like she had been caught committing a crime, which in a way, she had. She tried to play it off, smiling in that stiff way she did, and said she was just doing a security check, because someone had reported suspicious activity. I told her politely but firmly that my garage was not HOA property, and she had no business looking in. She huffed and said she would make a note of my refusal to cooperate. That was her favorite phrase, something she loved to say as though I were under some kind of civic duty to comply with her every whim. I let it go that day, but something about the way she looked at the garage made me uneasy. That garage held more than just tools. It also had some sensitive personal documents stored in a locked filing cabinet, and Mark sometimes kept his gear from work in there when he was off shift. We had nothing illegal inside, of course, but I didn't like the idea of anyone snooping around, least of all Karen, who had a habit of gossiping about anything she saw. The first real sign that she was up to something more serious came one morning when I found fresh scratches on the handle of my garage side door, the one that faced the backyard. They were faint, but they were definitely there, and they hadn't been there the day before. I showed them to Mark, and he immediately got suspicious. He told me it looked like someone had tried to use a key or maybe even a screwdriver to jimmy the lock. He asked me if anyone else besides us had a key to the garage, and I said no. That's when he told me that HOAs sometimes kept what they called master keys for certain properties, and that they were only supposed to be used in case of absolute emergencies, fire, flooding, that sort of thing. Knowing Karen, she probably saw emergency as any situation where she felt curious or annoyed. Mark told me to install a camera, which I did that very night. I put a small motion-activated camera on the corner of the garage roof facing the driveway, and another one inside the garage just above the main door. 2 days later, we had our proof. The footage showed Karen walking up to my garage in broad daylight while I was at work. She had a lanyard around her neck with several keys on it, and she tried one after the other on my garage door handle. When none of them worked, she pulled out her phone and started typing something furiously, probably complaining to someone. Then she walked away looking annoyed. Mark was livid when he saw the footage. He told me that what she had done could easily qualify as attempted unlawful entry, especially since she didn't have any authorization from the city or police to be trying keys on private property. He said if I wanted, we could file a formal police report, but I told him to wait. I wanted to give her one last chance to back off before we went nuclear. I printed out a still image from the footage and taped it to my garage door with a note that simply said, "Smile, you're on camera." That didn't go over well with Karen. That evening, she stormed up to my front porch, red in the face, waving a piece of paper around that looked like some kind of HOA bylaw printout. She said I was harassing her by posting threatening images, and that I had no right to surveil community property. I calmly reminded her that my garage was not community property and that the cameras were perfectly legal because they were pointed at my own property. She sputtered something about escalating this to the board, then stomped off. I thought that would be the end of it, but of course, with Karen, it never is. Over the next few days, Mark and I started noticing her walking by more often than usual, almost as if she was casing the place. She would slow down in front of the driveway, glare at the garage, and sometimes even take pictures with her phone. I could tell she was plotting something, but I didn't know what. That's when Mark decided to get proactive. He called a friend of his from the department and asked for advice. His friend suggested that if we suspected she might try again, we should be ready to catch her in the act. Not just on camera this time, but in person. Mark arranged to be home on his next day off, and we agreed to leave the garage locked as usual but keep the cameras rolling. Mark's next day off came on a Wednesday, and we prepared like we were setting up for a sting operation. We made sure the garage looked completely normal from the outside, nothing that would tip off Karen that we were paying extra attention. Inside, however, Mark set up a small folding chair in the corner near the workbench, his police radio clipped to his belt, his badge visible on his chest, and his sidearm holstered but within reach. He wasn't there to scare her, he said, just to make it clear that what she was doing was illegal and that there would be consequences if she crossed the line again. The camera inside the garage was live streaming to his phone, so he could watch the driveway from inside while keeping quiet. I went about my day as usual, even leaving the house for a couple of hours so she wouldn't suspect anything out of the ordinary. If Karen had been watching me, I wanted her to think this was just another normal day where the garage was unattended. By mid-afternoon, the tension had built to the point where I almost wished she wouldn't show up. But right around 3 o'clock, Mark's phone buzzed with a motion alert from the driveway camera. He watched as Karen strutted up the sidewalk, her ever-present lanyard bouncing on her chest, clipboard in hand, and a determined look on her face. She glanced around quickly, probably checking to see if any neighbors were outside, then walked straight up to the garage side door. Mark stayed completely silent inside, just watching her shadow through the crack of sunlight under the door. She knelt down, examined the lock, and then, just like in the footage from before, began trying keys. Mark waited until he heard the distinct sound of a key actually going into the lock. That was his cue. He stood up slowly, hand on his holster just in case, and moved to the door. He let her get as far as turning the key halfway before he yanked the door open. Karen nearly fell forward into the garage, completely caught off guard. The look on her face was priceless, her eyes went wide, and for a split second, she looked like a kid caught with her hand in the cookie jar. Then her expression hardened into that familiar scowl. Mark didn't raise his voice, but there was a sharp edge to it when he said, "Ma'am, step back from the door." She froze for a moment, then tried to recover her composure, straightening up and pointing at her clipboard like it was some kind of shield. She said she was conducting a safety inspection on behalf of the HOA and that she had every right to be there. Mark calmly told her that what she was doing constituted attempted unlawful entry and that she was trespassing on private property. He asked her flatly if she had the homeowner's permission to be trying keys on this door. She stammered something about community safety protocol, but he cut her off and asked if she had a warrant. That was when I quietly stepped out of the back patio and came around to join them, letting her know that she had no permission from me and that she needed to leave immediately. Karen's face turned bright red. She said that the HOA rules allowed her to access any structure that might pose a risk to the community. I told her the garage wasn't a risk to anyone and that the board had no authority to force entry. Mark added that even if the HOA had some kind of emergency clause, it didn't override state law regarding trespassing and unlawful entry. She tried to argue, but Mark finally identified himself formally as a police officer and told her that if she didn't step away right now, he would have no choice but to detain her for trespassing until a patrol car could arrive. That shut her up quickly. She backed away a few steps, muttering about how she was just trying to do her job, then stormed off down the driveway and out of sight. After she left, Mark turned to me and shook his head. He said he had seen some entitled HOA board members before, but this one was on another level. I agreed, but I had a sinking feeling this wasn't over. Karen didn't like to lose, and being embarrassed like that, caught red-handed by not just the homeowner but a uniformed cop, was going to make her even more determined to prove she was right. Sure enough, later that evening, we received an official letter from the HOA citing us for obstruction of community safety procedures and threatening a fine. Mark read the letter, crumpled it up, and tossed it in the trash. He said they could try to fine us all they wanted, but without legal standing, it was just paper. Still, I could feel the tension in the air. This wasn't just an argument about a garage anymore, it was a power struggle, and Karen was the kind of person who didn't know how to back down. The next few days were quiet, almost too quiet. Karen didn't show her face around my property, at least not when we were home, but we caught glimpses of her car driving by slowly more than once. Mark decided to take things a step further. He contacted his precinct and asked if they had any open cases in the neighborhood that might require surveillance, because if so, he could be assigned to monitor them during his off hours. It turned out that there had been a string of petty thefts from unlocked garages in a neighboring subdivision, and while it wasn't technically under our HOA's jurisdiction, it was close enough that his supervisor agreed to let him keep an eye out while staying on call. This gave him a valid reason to be on the property, in uniform, and to have police equipment with him. The following weekend, Mark decided to sit in the garage again, this time with a laptop connected to the camera feed so he could monitor everything in real time. I stayed inside the house, keeping an ear open. It was a warm Saturday afternoon, and plenty of neighbors were out mowing their lawns and chatting, so I didn't expect Karen to try anything that day. But sure enough, just before sunset, she appeared again. This time she wasn't alone, she had another board member with her, a man I recognized as one of her allies from the monthly meetings. They both walked straight up to the garage, this time with what looked like some kind of document in hand. Mark could hear them talking through the thin garage walls, Karen saying something about how the board voted unanimously, and how they had the right to inspect. Mark waited until they tried the key again, then opened the door just like before. Karen jumped back, startled, but the man with her immediately held up the paper like it was a warrant. Mark took it from him, looked it over, and nearly laughed. It was just a printout of an HOA resolution stating that board members had the right to perform visual inspections of properties for safety compliance. Mark handed it back and told them flatly that a resolution passed by a neighborhood board was not the same thing as a legal warrant and that they were still trespassing. The man tried to argue, but Mark said that if they didn't leave, he would call for backup and have them removed. Karen looked furious but eventually dragged the man away, hissing at him about how they would take this to court. That night, Mark filed an official incident report with his department, documenting everything. He said that if they tried it again, they could escalate it to a criminal matter and press charges. I was starting to feel a little more confident now that we had a paper trail, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that Karen wasn't done yet. The incident report must have rattled Karen more than she let on, because for nearly a week she stayed away completely, but her absence didn't bring me much comfort. If anything, it felt like the calm before a storm, the kind that builds silently and then crashes down all at once. During that week, Mark kept a close eye on the cameras, and I noticed he was spending more time on the phone with colleagues, discussing procedure, legal language, and even asking about the process of obtaining a warrant for HOA harassment cases. He told me that while HOAs had certain contractual rights through their covenants, they could not override state or federal law, and repeated unlawful attempts to gain access to private property could indeed be grounds for a criminal investigation. This gave me a strange mix of hope and anxiety. Hope because I wanted this nightmare to end, but anxiety because I knew that Karen would not take kindly to being confronted with the law in a way that she couldn't argue out of. The turning point came on a Monday morning when I opened my mailbox and found not just another HOA letter but a certified envelope with a return address from the HOA legal representative. Inside was a notice claiming that the board had approved an emergency inspection of my property due to suspected hazardous storage conditions inside the garage. The letter stated that failure to provide access within 72 hours would result in fines, suspension of community privileges, and possible legal action. Mark read the letter and let out a long, low whistle. He said this was exactly the kind of overreach that could be used as evidence in a case, and he immediately called his precinct to explain the situation. After speaking to a superior and providing the video evidence from previous incidents, Mark was given permission to escalate this as a potential case of harassment and attempted unlawful entry. Even more significantly, his department issued him a warrant allowing him to be on site in an official capacity to prevent any unauthorized entry. It wasn't a warrant to search anyone else's property, of course, but it gave him the authority to intervene if Karen or the HOA attempted to trespass again. That warrant changed everything. We pinned it to a corkboard inside the garage just to have it on hand, and Mark made a plan to spend the next few days stationed inside whenever possible. He said if Karen tried again, this time it wouldn't just be a warning or an incident report, it would be a lawful intervention. I could feel the tension winding tighter with each passing hour, like a rubber band stretched to its breaking point. I went about my daily routine, but every creak of the driveway, every sound of a car slowing down outside made my heart race. By Wednesday afternoon, my fears were confirmed. Karen showed up again, but this time she wasn't alone. She had 2 more board members with her and a man I didn't recognize who looked like some kind of contractor or inspector. They parked their SUV right in front of my driveway and got out with clipboards, cameras, and what appeared to be a set of bolt cutters. I was inside the kitchen when I saw them through the window, and I immediately called out to Mark, who was already in the garage with the warrant pinned next to him. He didn't hesitate. He got into position and waited silently. From the driveway camera feed, we watched as Karen marched up like a general leading a charge. She rattled the garage handle once, loudly, and announced to no one in particular that she was conducting an emergency inspection under HOA authority. When no one answered, she nodded to the man with the bolt cutters, clearly planning to cut the lock. That was Mark's moment. The garage door flew open so quickly that Karen actually stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the other board member behind her. Mark stepped out into the driveway, badge glinting in the sunlight, his voice calm but firm as he said, "Stop right there. You are attempting to forcibly enter private property without consent or lawful authority. I have a warrant authorizing me to intervene and prevent unlawful entry." Karen froze, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. She tried to sputter something about board rights, but Mark held up the warrant for her to see and explained that this was no longer a neighborhood dispute, this was a matter of law enforcement. The contractor looked nervous and started backing away toward his truck, clearly not wanting to get involved. One of the board members mumbled something about calling their lawyer, but Mark told them they were free to do so from off the property. He then asked them, one by one, to step back and leave. Karen, of course, didn't go quietly. She accused us of hiding something dangerous, said she had multiple complaints from neighbors about strange smells coming from the garage, which was absurd because all I kept in there were tools, a lawnmower, and some old paint cans stored safely on a shelf. Mark calmly told her that if she had any evidence of a real hazard, she could take it to the fire marshal or city code enforcement, but that as of now, she had no legal grounds to be here. She kept arguing, her voice rising loud enough that a few neighbors started peeking out their windows, some even coming out onto their porches to watch. The standoff lasted several long minutes until finally, one of the other board members grabbed Karen by the arm and urged her to leave, clearly embarrassed by the scene she was making. They retreated to their SUV, Karen glaring at me the entire time as though I had just committed some grand betrayal. As they drove off, Mark exhaled slowly, the adrenaline finally draining from his face. He told me that was probably the last straw and that she would either back down for good or take the matter to court. Either way, we had everything documented, the footage, the letter, the warrant, and even witnesses now that neighbors had seen the confrontation. That night, Mark filed another formal report, and we sent copies of all the footage and documents to the HOA's legal office along with a notice that any further attempts to access the property without a city-issued warrant would be treated as criminal trespass. It felt like we had drawn a firm line in the sand, one that even Karen couldn't ignore. For the first time in weeks, I slept soundly, knowing we had the law on our side. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that this war with Karen wasn't truly over, that she was somewhere in her house, seething, plotting her next move, unwilling to accept defeat. Over the next several days, things became oddly quiet again, but this silence felt different from before. It wasn't the calm before a storm this time, it was more like the eerie stillness of someone regrouping, strategizing, preparing for one last attempt to prove a point. I knew Karen well enough by now to understand that public humiliation and an official police report weren't going to sit well with her. She was the type of person who thrived on control, and when that control slipped through her fingers, she would do anything to snatch it back. Mark told me to stay vigilant and not let my guard down, even if it seemed like things had settled. He spent every evening after work either in the garage or in the driveway, sometimes chatting with neighbors who passed by, sometimes just sitting silently with his patrol radio on, letting everyone see that he was a visible presence. That in itself seemed to calm some of the tension in the neighborhood, people waved more often, even thanked him for keeping an eye out. But I could still sense the undercurrent of resentment coming from Karen's corner of the street. It was the following Saturday evening when the final confrontation happened, and even now I can replay every moment in my head with startling clarity. The sun had just dipped below the trees, leaving everything bathed in that soft, golden glow that comes before dusk. Mark had decided to spend a few hours doing some light maintenance on his cruiser inside the garage, checking the fluids, restocking his first aid kit, organizing his gear, and I was on the back porch sipping a beer, enjoying the warm air. That was when I heard the distinct sound of multiple car doors closing out front, too many for it to be just a neighbor pulling into a driveway. I set my bottle down and stepped around the side of the house just in time to see a police car pull up, followed by Karen's SUV right behind it. My stomach dropped, she had actually called the cops on us. 2 officers stepped out of the patrol car, both of whom Mark knew from the department. They looked calm, professional, not like they were here for an emergency, but the fact that they were here at all made my pulse quicken. Karen got out of her SUV, waving her hands and pointing at my garage like she had just uncovered some great criminal conspiracy. She was talking fast, her words tumbling over one another as she explained that I had been refusing lawful inspection, and that there was evidence of hazardous material storage that was putting the entire community at risk. The officers listened politely but didn't look convinced. At that moment, the garage door rolled open from the inside, and Mark stepped out in full uniform, badge shining under the fading light. He greeted the officers by name, asked them what the call was about, and calmly explained that he was already on site with a department-issued warrant to prevent unlawful entry. The look on Karen's face was almost comical. She went pale, then flushed bright red, as though she hadn't anticipated that her plan would backfire so spectacularly. She sputtered that he couldn't use his position to intimidate her and that she had rights as an HOA board member, but one of the officers politely reminded her that HOA covenants did not supersede state law and that any attempt to force entry without the homeowner's consent could be considered trespassing. Karen refused to let it go. She demanded that the officers force me to open the garage so she could verify what was inside. That was when Mark handed them a copy of the certified letter she had sent, the incident reports from both previous attempts, and the video footage still stored on his laptop. The officers took their time reviewing everything right there in the driveway while Karen fumed silently, her arms crossed and foot tapping like an impatient child. When they were done, they turned to her and informed her that not only did she lack legal grounds for her demand, but that further attempts to gain entry without a city-issued inspection order could result in criminal charges. Karen completely lost her composure then. She shouted that the whole neighborhood would suffer because of my stubbornness, that if something terrible happened it would be my fault, and that the HOA had the authority to override stupid personal property claims. The officers warned her to calm down, but she wouldn't listen. She kept yelling until finally one of them told her she was bordering on disturbing the peace and that she needed to leave the property immediately. She stood there shaking with anger, glaring at me, then at Mark, then at the officers, before finally storming back to her SUV and slamming the door so hard I thought the window might shatter. She sped off down the street, leaving the officers standing there shaking their heads. After she left, the officers stayed for a few more minutes, talking with Mark and me about what had just happened. They assured us that we had handled everything correctly and that with the documentation we had, we were in a very strong position should the HOA try to pursue legal action. They also said they would file their own report about the incident, which meant there would now be an independent police record corroborating our side of the story. That gave me a huge sense of relief, though I still felt the leftover adrenaline buzzing in my veins. Later that night, after things had quieted down and Mark had finished putting away his gear, we sat in the garage together, just talking. He admitted that when the call first came through the dispatch, he was worried that Karen might have fabricated some kind of serious allegation that would force a search, but once he saw who the responding officers were, he knew we were going to be fine. He told me he was proud of how we had handled it, calmly, lawfully, and without stooping to her level. The next morning, I found another letter in the mailbox, but this time it wasn't a threat. It was an official notice from the HOA board announcing that Karen had resigned from her position as president effective immediately. The letter didn't say why, but I could imagine the fallout from the previous night had been too much for even her loyal supporters to defend. I stood there in the driveway holding that letter and felt an almost giddy sense of victory. It wasn't just about winning against Karen, it was about standing up for myself, for my property, and proving that just because someone hides behind rules and bylaws doesn't mean they're above the law itself. Mark laughed when he saw the letter and said it was probably the most peaceful outcome we could have hoped for. No lawsuits, no drawn-out hearings, no escalation beyond what had already happened. Just quiet, simple resolution. I nodded, feeling lighter than I had in months. For the first time in what felt like forever, I opened my garage door and got to work on my truck without looking over my shoulder, without checking the camera feed every few minutes, without feeling like someone was about to come marching up the driveway to tell me I was doing something wrong. The garage felt like mine again, truly mine, and that simple sense of security was worth more than anything. In the days that followed Karen's resignation, the entire neighborhood seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief, as though a heavy weight had been lifted from the cul-de-sac. People who had once stayed quiet for fear of being targeted suddenly became much friendlier. Neighbors stopped by to chat, some of them admitting they had seen Karen's behavior getting worse over the past year but hadn't wanted to be the ones to confront her. One older couple who lived 2 houses down told me they had been on the receiving end of her harassment last winter when she claimed their holiday lights violated aesthetic guidelines. They laughed as they recounted how she tried to fine them for having too many reindeer decorations on their lawn. Hearing these stories made me realize just how widespread her overreach had been and how much frustration she had been causing behind the scenes. Her resignation wasn't just my victory, it was a win for everyone who had been quietly enduring her petty tyranny. Mark continued to stay with me for a few more months while he saved up for his own place, and in that time, the garage became more than just a place to park cars and store tools, it became a gathering spot. Neighbors who had previously avoided eye contact when walking by would now stop to say hello, sometimes stepping inside to admire Mark's cruiser or talk about whatever project I was working on. There was a sense of community that hadn't been there before, as though people felt freer to enjoy their own properties without fearing some clipboard-wielding board member would appear to scold them. I even started hosting weekend barbecues in the driveway, something I hadn't done in years. People brought their kids, their dogs, their lawn chairs, and we sat around swapping stories about all the ridiculous HOA letters we'd received over the years. There was plenty of laughter, and with each retelling, the sting of those past conflicts seemed to fade. The HOA itself changed too. With Karen gone, a special election was held to fill her position, and for once, multiple people actually volunteered to run. Usually, no one wanted the job, which was probably why Karen had been able to hold on to power for so long. This time, though, folks seemed determined to make sure history didn't repeat itself. A retired teacher named Linda ended up being elected president, and from the start she made it clear that things were going to be different. She sent out a letter to all homeowners promising transparency, fairness, and a commitment to work with residents rather than against them. The first board meeting under her leadership was packed, and people actually seemed happy to be there instead of dreading it. Rules were reviewed, unnecessary restrictions were loosened, and the board even voted to end the so-called Master Key program that had given Karen and others access to private property. It felt like a new era for the neighborhood, one where respect for individual rights came first. For me personally, the whole ordeal changed the way I thought about standing up for myself. In the past, I might have just grumbled and gone along with whatever the HOA demanded, even when it felt unreasonable, because I didn't want conflict. But watching Karen cross line after line, and seeing how Mark handled it with patience and professionalism, taught me that there's a big difference between being confrontational and simply refusing to be bullied. We had stayed calm, documented everything, and used the law to protect ourselves, and in the end, that had been enough. It felt empowering to know that I hadn't just let someone trample over my rights, and I could tell Mark was proud that we had resolved it without anyone getting hurt or arrested. Even now, every time I walk into my garage, I still notice the little camera we installed and the corkboard where the warrant is pinned. We decided to leave both there as a quiet reminder, not out of paranoia anymore, but as a symbol of what we overcame. The scratches on the door handle are still faintly visible too, but I've decided not to sand them out. They're a part of the story now, proof that there was a time when someone thought they could just walk in and take control of something that wasn't theirs, and proof that we didn't let them. Sometimes when I'm out there late at night working on my truck with the radio playing softly, I catch myself smiling at how peaceful everything feels. No more glancing nervously out the window every time I hear footsteps, no more surprise letters demanding compliance, no more shadow of Karen looming over the neighborhood. Just quiet, honest peace. The last time I saw Karen was a couple of weeks after her resignation. She was getting into her SUV outside her house, and for a moment our eyes met across the street. She didn't wave, didn't scowl, didn't say a word, just got into the vehicle and drove away. I don't know if she moved out permanently or just decided to keep to herself, but either way, I felt no anger anymore. Whatever war she thought she was fighting, it was over, and I didn't feel the need to gloat. If anything, I hoped she had learned something from the whole mess, that power isn't about forcing people to bend to your will, but about earning their respect. Maybe that was wishful thinking, but I like to believe even someone as stubborn as Karen could take a lesson from the experience. Looking back now, I realize how close this came to spiraling out of control, and how lucky we were that it didn't. If Mark hadn't been living with me, if we hadn't installed those cameras, if we hadn't had the presence of mind to stay calm when confronted, things could have gone a very different way. But instead, we stood our ground, and we came out stronger for it. My son got valuable real-world experience dealing with a civilian dispute, my neighbors got a safer, fairer community, and I got my garage back, not just physically, but emotionally. It feels like mine again, a place of peace and work and pride, untouched by petty power plays. And every time I open that door, I can't help but feel grateful for my son, for the officers who came when called, and for the fact that the law was on our side. Life in the neighborhood is quieter now, and I wouldn't have it any other way.